All right, this is my first live ever, and I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. So I'm hoping that I can access this later so I can upload it to my YouTube channel later. And yes, I did start this live a little bit earlier than I originally intended because, whatever, we're not gonna get into that. But okay, so basically what I'm going to be doing is reading a part of this book called the Magdalen Manuscript. There's 3 parts to it, and I'm going to be reading this one part called One Woman's Story. So this book starts off with a channeled message from Mary Magdalene. The channeler, Tom Kenyon, he also has his commentary, which is the second part of this book, and then his partner, Judy Sion, that's what I'll be reading today, is a bit about her life. And it's a short read. It's like 100 pages, so I'm hoping like 1 or 2 recordings and I'll be able to finish this whole thing. But the reason that I wanted to read this is because I just found it really relatable for the time that I first started reading it, which was a year ago, because I was recently separated, going through a lot of like unpacking and processing from the marriage that was not healthy. And yeah, this book really helped me feel seen as a woman, as a mother, as a wife. And so, yeah. Okay. There's literally no viewers, which I'm like happy for. My social anxiety is what it is. Anyway. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned this, but my YouTube channel is called lavioletica, similar to my TikTok, but with 1 A at the end, okay? In case you guys want to watch the whole video. So, One Woman's Story by Judy Sion. Life spit me out of my mother's womb in Appalachia, not to find waiting hands but a cold floor, as she was unattended at my birth. My mother and I shared this experience in a little clapboard house by the side of railroad tracks in Pennington Gap, Virginia. My birth name was Phyllis Elizabeth Sion, originally Sion with an S. Within months, I was thrust into another environment, as my birth mother left home with me and my older brothers and sister to escape an abusive marriage and in search of her dream. Damn. She wanted to be a country singer, and so when I was a month or so old and my father was at work, she put us all on a bus and we traveled across the state to South Central Virginia, where she left us with her parents while she went to find a singing job. But as life would twist, shortly after our arrival, grandfather's tractor pinned him underneath when he took a hill the wrong way. My older brother told me this story only a few years ago, when we found each other finally. He was running alongside the tractor, so he ran to the house for help. He remembers grandmother running with her big black nurse's bag. She took out a huge hypodermic needle, which she filled with morphine for the pain. He watched her first squirt the liquid into the air and then inject it into grandfather. Then she tried to lift the tractor off him, breaking her back instead. Wow. This is all a true story, by the way. Oh gosh. I can't look at the comments and or anything right now related to this live because this is my first live and I'm nervous. I have a lot of social anxiety. So anyways, I'm just gonna keep reading. Okay. My grandfather died underneath the tractor, and grandmother never walked again. I never knew these people. I was an infant as this drama played out, left inside the house while life and death called to its side who it wanted in the moment. We were handed out in the 4 directions, like leaves caught in a swirling wind. I wound up at a motel restaurant owned by a distant cousin, while family frantically searched for someone to take in an infant. There weren't many adoption agencies in the tobacco plains of Virginia in those years. I suspect families preferred to take care of their own as best they could. And so it was that I was ultimately farmed out, like the tobacco I grew around, and raised by Queen Victoria reincarnated, a staunch and severe woman, a schoolteacher, who couldn't have children of her own. At this apocalyptic juncture of the fates, I was still quite shy of 1 year, and I had already earned another equally portentous name, Judy Lee Pope. Ruby Carter Pope loved me dearly, there is no doubt about that. Her life, and therefore the life of her husband, who became my father, centered around her church, her family, her schoolchildren, and the constriction of me. But her God was a fearsome and jealous thing I couldn't tolerate, and as soon as I got old enough to question, which in my instance was quite young, we came to loggerheads. I grew up almost totally without playmates, wandering the tobacco fields of the Piedmont region of Virginia with a St. Bernard dog and a borrowed horse. She sewed many of my clothes from flour sacks and never did anything herself but work and sacrifice. These were my models. Oh, and judgment. They did a lot of judging in the country of Virginia. We were very poor. Though measured against poverty of Brunswick County, Virginia, we were middle class, I suspect. My father ran a country store that essentially served the abysmally poor black families that lived around us. I remember one barefoot woman who came in daily. She wore one single stocking over her head and ate one can of sardines and an orange soda every day. It never occurred to me then that this was probably all she had to eat, and it never occurred to me then either that she never paid. Dad wrote up little pieces of paper that represented bills. That represented bills. He died when I was 18, and I found boxes of these unpaid bills, totaling well over $20,000, which was a staggering amount of money to be owed in those days. He must have fed half of Rawlins, Virginia, and simply never told anyone. I grew up being schooled in the fork of a pear tree. My teachers were a voice in the wind and whispers in the forest. I fashioned a bow and arrows myself, and when the horse across the road was offered to ride, I left home for hours every day to find something. I don't know what. I don't know if you guys can hear my background music, but oh, I love this song. So I'm trying to focus. Okay. I never had riding lessons. The horse taught me. The saddle and bridle anyone could figure out. And when the saddle slid underneath him with me in it, on my first attempt, I had a little talk with him about letting the air out of his stomach before I cinched the saddle. I had to have this little talk with him often, but it worked. And when his ears pricked up one day when he saw a fallen tree in the field, I knew what he wanted. He wanted to fly. And so we flew over it. I leaned into him. It was the logical thing to do. He jumped the tree. I just got to fly along with him. After that, there was nothing that stopped us. We forded rivers and trotted right down the middle of creeks. We wandered for miles through dense forests and galloped over fields and meadows. And if anything got in our way, we jumped it. No one ever knew where I went on this horse. You could travel for days and not see another human being if you knew where to go through the forests and back roads of Brunswick County then. I lied to my mother, of course. She wouldn't have allowed me to leave the yard, but for well-crafted lies that became a necessity of life very early. She objected to everything and anything. To her, almost everything in life was either sinful or dangerous. I never went to a birthday party or slept over at a girlfriend's house. No one ever slept over at my house. These were fantasies other people lived on the television. I had no idea people really lived like that. My adopted mother chose my clothes and told me what to wear every day to school. And even when I was much older, if I put on a sleeveless dress in June, she said I would get cold, and she added layers. If I put on a sweater in January, she told me I'd be too hot and dressed me down. The ultimate effect of this control was that I didn't have any idea what I felt or what I wanted. I wasn't allowed to date until I was 17, and she sat stony-faced at the window, watching for me to come home even then, so she could approve my appearance when I returned to make sure I hadn't discovered anything sinful, I'm sure. Once, my date walked me to the door with her shirt not properly tucked in. I was never allowed to date him again. I think I was still in love with him a decade later, when we met and released each other from the fantasy we had each held in our own way for all those years, simply because we had never been allowed our time. My father and mother slept in separate double beds in one bedroom. I slept with my mother until I left for college. My grandmother had the other bedroom. Ruby refused, heralding a variety of excuses, to ever finish the room upstairs. Thusly, she even managed to control how I slept at night, and she managed to never have to sleep with my father. "Quit fidgeting," she used to say to me when I turned too often. "Lie still." Summers were endless, drenched in suspicion of tepid, stagnant pools of humidity. I lay for hours on end, too hot to sleep, not allowed to move, only my mind free to move about. Winters, I lay weighted under piles of ancient quilts, unmoving then due to the oppressions of stiff blankets from the Civil War holding me in their spell, haunting me with their visions, yet still cold in the depths of a Virginia winter. But I had my music and dance, and I had the forest, which instructed me to dance on her naked skin, barefoot, until I could walk across the forest floor without making a sound. I had a borrowed horse, a beloved St. Bernard named Mickey, a teacher in a pear tree, a little friend in the jack-in-the-pulpit plant, and another in the pink lady slipper. These were my childhood advisors. There is one lesson I will never forget, and now I watch it come to pass as a prophecy in my own life. From my memory, it was my first lesson delivered in the fork of that pear tree, where I wedged myself daily for years, dialoguing with what I called words without a voice. I was told about every possible life experience would come to me, so that I would ultimately understand and have compassion for the human experience. And I was told that someday, when I was full of these life experiences, my voice would travel around the world, sharing what I had learned, and that what I had to say would have a tremendous impact, but only when I really didn't care about such influence. I was also told that there was another part of me out there somewhere, and that someday I would meet the mate to my being, and that our work would be together, and I wouldn't get up in the morning to go to a job like other people. I was told that he was a part of my soul, and that our work together would have a vast beneficial influence on the world. That is essentially what I care to share of what I remember. And there is one other early awareness that I distinctly remember. I knew that the secrets of the universe lay in the physical experiences possible between a man and a woman when they truly loved each other. I knew that love was the greatest gift you could be given. I knew there was a place you could go, a road only opened through the gateway of physicality that few have ever walked. And I knew that was why the church shamed sexuality, and why governments had such rules and regulations to govern what they call marriage, and why the whole subject had been both tabooed and regulated throughout this age of civilization. I suspected the serpent wasn't evil, and I knew that Eve must have been brilliant to want more knowledge, and I knew it was illogical for the loving God who had created us to not want us to know everything. I suspected if there was such a beast as the devil, the smartest place for him to hide would be in the church. I knew the deepest secrets had to do with love, with what I now call sacred relationship. I knew that my purpose was somehow tied to reintegration of these secrets. And I also knew there was another part of me out there somewhere, and I began a lifetime search for him. I thought I saw him once, his face pressed against the window of a bus that slowly passed us on Route 1 on the way to Petersburg. For a minute, the bus and our car traveled at the same speed and our eyes met. We linked in that brief moment at some place that was holy, though we were only maybe, 8, 9, or 10 years old. It would be another 40 years before I touched such a holy place with a man again. I knew he played guitar and wrote songs and had the voice of an angel. I always thought I'd know his voice if I ever heard it. Okay, I'm gonna take a break. That was good. Oh, loady load. Man, this book gets me really emotional. I think I'm gonna read a little bit more. But damn, it just gets me all in my feels. And I think I want to stop and make commentaries as I'm reading as well. We'll see. I'm just going with the flow for now. But anyways, I'll probably just read a couple more pages because dang. And yes, this is the real life story of Judy Sion. In terms of what shaped me, I can look back and remember the incidents that made me question the veracity of what was presented as authority. In the church I was forced to attend, I heard preaching on Sunday about love and non-judgment. I heard preaching about how God didn't care what you wore, but only saw what was in your heart. But I frequently overheard parishioners and the preacher criticizing and demeaning each other before they even got out the door. Can you believe she wears that to church? My young ears heard when my logic knew that was all the poor woman in question had to wear. I could see hearts then, and I saw purity in that old woman, but they only saw clothing. Well, you know where she comes from, don't you? I wouldn't expect much out of her. Her family is trash. I couldn't understand blaming someone for the actions of their parents or their distant cousins, and I remember hearing, always be good to your family. They're all you've ever got. And always remember that blood is thicker than water. That's a funny thing to say to an adopted child who had no blood around. I simply never believed what I was told by the humans around me, and there were extraordinary events that made me look elsewhere for answers. I don't remember how old I was, maybe 8 or 9. I had just gotten into bed one summer. My mother was grading papers and my father was reading. I distinctly remember pulling a single sheet up to my chin when a glow appeared in the room. It transcended the darkness, creating an unmistakable luminescence, a pregnant wetness that made the very air seem visible, like floating molecules of moist light. A fear rose in me that was incalculable, beyond my wildest imagination. I had no backdrop for a mystical experience, though I am sure now that is what this was. 3 lights appeared in the room, one on either side of the bed and one in the very center of the foot of the bed. A form appeared below the center light and it seemed to rock, though now I understand that was probably a pulsation. I was frozen, completely unable to move, which exacerbated my fear. I told myself that if I could only move one digit of my finger, I could break this terrible spell, and so I focused all of my energy on moving one finger. It was impossible. So then I tried to focus all my will on my throat, to scream for help. I could make no sound. I thought I would surely die there, frozen to the spot. My father came down the hallway toward the bathroom, and I knew that if he came into the room, he would break the spell. And I sent every thought I could muster to please enter the room. But he stopped at the door, as if he'd forgotten something, and he turned around and never entered. I knew the lights, whatever they were, had planted a thought to change his mind, and I knew I was dead. I don't know how long this otherworldly spell lasted, but slowly the lights on the side dimmed. The pulsing of the center figure slowed in direct relation to the dimming lights. The lights on either side disappeared at the same time. Blip! I was now transfixed by only the central light above the rocking figure. Imperceptibly, slowly, the rocking slowed, in direct proportion to the light slowly extinguishing. Finally I was held only by the unmoving apparition. a formless form, underneath a single dim light. As immediately as it had begun, simultaneously the figure disappeared, the light left, and I was free to bolt out of the bedroom and tear down the hall. I threw myself into a chair, hanging on for dear life, and told my mother what had happened. I refused to go back to bed, though eventually exhaustion went out. In the morning we received a phone call from an aunt to say that her aged mother-in-law had died at precisely the same time as my incident occurred, and so it was that it became legend in my family that great aunt somebody or other had visited me when she passed. My only memory of her was of her sitting in a rocking chair, slowly rocking back and forth, and perhaps it was she, though I prefer Metatron's explanation. He says it was an initiation from 3 masters from other dimensions, and that it could only be given after I had finally decided to stay in a body. Though that decision, if Metatron was right, has been questioned many times since. Okay, hold up. That's trippy as fuck. So she's saying that she connected with an archangel, Archangel Metatron, who is like in the hierarchy of all the angels, is like the tippy top, which is like different from even the other archangels. But anyways, and that his explanation of what happened to her as a child in her room that night with those 3 lights was that she had finally decided to continue staying in her body, so she decided to continue living out her life. And so she was initiated. Like, what? That's crazy. Anyways, fascinating though. Okay. I suppose that because Ruby had not allowed ordinary life to touch me for so long, or for so many years, I rushed headlong into it when my father died, and I left for college at 18. I clearly began to have those life experiences the voice spoke to me about. I fell in and out of love, like children learning to walk, fall down. I was desperate for love. Desperate to be touched, desperate for passion, the love toddler landed safely on her bottom until one night when a date refused to take me home. Oh shit. Okay. I think my anxiety is getting a little bit better. Oh, River, you're so cute. Oh. Thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. This book is really fascinating. I think what really gets me about this story is that it's her real life experiences. And like I said in the beginning of this, is like it's so relatable as a woman, as a mother, as a wife, as a child. Okay, so anyways, I remember the feeling of fright when he drove past my street and turned instead down a dark road toward his own apartment building. His intentions were made clear when he used a martial arts grip on my arm, forcing me inside his apartment. When he turned his back inside, I bolted, running for my life. He took chase. As I ran, I had to make a choice between staying in the shadows or trying to make a phone call. The phone booth lay in light, clearly visible to anyone chasing a frightened young girl. I chose the lighted phone booth, hoping that I could make an emergency call before he spotted me. But when I got to it, the phone was broken, and he had spotted me. I then ran toward the beach, sinking deeply into sand with each stride and exhausting myself trying to run through marsh grass and sand dunes. But I got away. Oh my god, my blood was roiling with that one. And that's exactly why I'm taking classes to learn how to fight. Like, it just pisses me off. Okay, anyways. After walking several miles along the beach, I saw figures approaching in the dim moonlight, and I panicked and took back to the roadside to cover the last 5 or so miles home. It was now the middle of the night, closer to dawn than night. It had been a long night of escape and terror. A car pulled alongside me, and a voice said,
You must be crazy walking out here in the middle of the night. What's wrong? Let me give you a lift home. You're not safe out here walking like this. I peered in to see a safe enough looking face, one I had never seen before. I must have been crazy because I got into the car. Excuse me. He immediately sped up to a pace that left no possibility of jumping and pulled out a blade that gleamed in the moonlight, leveling it sideways at my throat. He drove somewhere deep into the dismal swamp, as far as the road went then. The rest of that night and into the dawn are a blur of blood and contusions and struggling, with moonlight sharding off a knife blade. After the battle was over, he drove me back to the very street I had tried so hard to get to that night, and dropped me on the corner. I wore a fencing mask for weeks, ashamed somehow of my cuts and bruises, as if a girl trying so hard to get home had done something to deserve the terror of that night. I'm gonna cry. Oh, fuck. Okay. I ultimately went to the police, but at the time, Virginia Beach had a policy of printing all rape victims' names in the local paper, and I knew Queen Victoria would hear what would happen. And that's her stepmother, by the way. I just wasn't ready for what that would create in my life. The thought of her accusations, of her screams of sin and guilt, were more oppressive, more terrifying than anything that had happened to me that night. I closed that door and went on with my life with a passion. I went to work at a radio station and moved into a phase of success in media and communication that was to continue through all the emotional turmoil of the next 30 years. I met a handsome young man and we began to date, getting more and more serious. He asked me to marry him. I was thinking about it, though there were signs I was ignoring, things about him and other issues with me. I had been having problems with my period, but nothing else seemed wrong. So I ignored these sporadic appearances and continued my life. Finally, I sought help. Initially, I was told I had a tumor. Then I was told I was 7 months pregnant. This was not in my life plan. I suppose because I had not enjoyed my own childhood, I had no intention of ever having children of my own. Oh, that's so sad. And I know a lot of women struggle with that one too. Children, from what I had seen around me growing up, are what kept women from having a life. I viewed women as trapped in an endless cycle of sacrifice, not to mention that I was scared to death of the shame and the pain. I married the handsome young man and spent a terrifying night giving birth to a girl. I was told, perhaps, it seemed the only solution at the time. My doctor had arranged a private adoption, and I never saw her. Oh. It was the best choice I felt I could make under the circumstances. I had no money at all, and I felt she would be much better off with a family that could afford to raise her. I suppose my own childhood of flour-sack clothes and few opportunities was still too fresh in my mind, and it was the only way to keep Queen Victoria from knowing and avoiding sinking. Wait, and it was the only way to keep Queen Victoria from knowing and avoid sinking the illustrious and noble but poor Southern family into shame. I hid the last 2 months of the pregnancy, never leaving the apartment. I had learned at a very young age to draw the shades on things that was not supposed to be seen, and I had become that. My handsome young husband turned out to be gay, and though he loved me as much as a gay man can love a woman, I was, after all, still a woman. Through all of this, I had managed to work my way through college in music, drama, and philosophy. I had stumbled into radio as a DJ when women were first allowed that joy, and from there I discovered the power of advertising. I moved into one of the most creative ad agencies in North America and worked my way into a position of authority and respect at a very young age, in what was still a man's world there as well. I won awards and honors and was highly paid. I had a magic touch that translated into high profits for my clients, and I loved what I did. I lived what was, I suppose, a dual life. My days were filled with producing television commercials, planning campaigns, writing radio jingles, buying media, negotiating with clients and reps. My terrain ranged from the boardroom to the studio. I was a rare duck, equally adept at the creative end and the business end. I also seemed to possess a psychic ability in advertising. Once I knew the soul of a client, I could see how the business or product or image flowed out of who he or she was, and could just as easily see what ingredients were needed to position that image or message. Then I could write and design the piece, whether it was print or audio or video. And much to my surprise, I could just as easily sense the budget and skew it where it belonged, holding huge traffic patterns of media in my mind. I thrilled at filling in the mental crossword puzzles, where the demographics of listeners, viewers, readers cross-matched certain words in a spot, or a visual design to reach a certain segment of the market, thus assuring sales. But my nights were not as successful. We looked good together, and we had bought a home that was way over our heads, as all young yuppies are expected to do. It was a Spanish mansion, with a hand-painted tile, fireplace, and picture frame molding. There was a fountain in the back courtyard, a marble foyer that ran about 40 feet long to the foot of the staircase that could have easily have been the scene for Gone with the Wind. It even boasted a servants' staircase. Of course, we had no servants, and our nights were spent trying to clean the alternating black and white marble tiles in the front foyer. The roof leaked and sadly needed replacing, and the kitchen had never been brought into the 19th century, much less the 20th. The illusion was great, but you couldn't cook there. And so after working all day, I worked alongside my husband to renovate this ancient mansion at night. We had lots of parties. He loved parties. But I always worried about who he'd fall in love with before the night was over. Dan. His depression seemed to get worse when he was drinking, and I knew our marriage was as much of an illusion as the Spanish mansion. But you never know what will break the camel's back. One morning on the way to work, I skipped along the sidewalk toward my car, trying to admire my dark green Buick Electra. It looked good in the sunlight, and clients liked it, though my heart ached for my old MG. A construction worker sat forlornly on the curb by the fender of my car. I ignored him as I stepped to the other side of the car and jumped back in shock. The driver's side had been sliced open, as if a giant had mistaken it for a can of green beans. I stood there gawking, my jaw hanging against my chest. The construction worker stood up, hard hat in hand over his chest, as if in respect for my now deceased vehicle. My demolition crane was on the way to a job, and when we took the corner, it just jumped off the truck and did that to your car. We had the knife on it instead of the ball. They left me behind to wait for the owner to show up. I don't know why I cracked at that moment, but it was at that precise moment that I decided I needed to make a change. Okay, I'm gonna take a little breaky break. Let me see. I'm like, damn, what is this chapter in? Okay, give me a second, guys.
Alright, I'm back. All that reading, I needed to get something to drink. Oh my gosh, this story is so packed with information. It's so good. Okay. Anyways, if you guys are just hopping on, I'm planning to, if I can figure out, I'm not very tech savvy, but I'm planning to upload this to my YouTube channel, lavioletica. It has one A at the end. Hello, hello, Adnan Khan. How am I? I'm good. A little tired. I had a big ass lunch. Hi, Hayden. Life is good. I had a really beautiful day. Like a really beautiful day. Okay. Back to the story. I don't know why I cracked at that moment, but it was at that precise moment that I decided I needed to make a change. I managed to get to work only to be called into the president's office. He announced that he was leaving advertising and closing the business that month. I had been there 5 years and I loved my job. I was a writer and creator. I produced radio and television commercials and planned campaigns and managed huge budgets for clients. These people were more family than I'd ever known. I had just been given up for adoption again. When I got home that night and my husband was no emotional wear to be found, preferring liquor and a few ice cubes, I snapped. Women keep score retroactively. Men erase their bad marks at the end of each day. So I was at 5 years and not much rope left. This was the 3 millionth time he hadn't been there for me. He figured he hadn't done anything wrong that day. Besides, he'd always gotten away with it before. When he drank, he always threatened suicide. Then I always hid the keys to his car and pleaded earnestly for him to come to his senses, which usually meant staying up all night negotiating deep passages of his inner turmoil, after which he usually celebrated by cleaning the marble tiles or stripping furniture. But it had been a bad day, and that night I was a new woman. This time I threw the keys at him, suggested he take a long drive, preferably off a short pier, packed my suitcase, and walked out the door. Oh, she was done. I left him the Spanish mansion. Hold up. This is really loud. I left him the Spanish mansion on the lake, the antique furniture, the statue of David, and a slightly damaged Buick Electra. Luckily, I had built a good reputation in advertising and was quickly offered a job in television. The day I signed my contract at the TV station, management walked out, leaving me the only person on staff at a management level. And so it was that I ran a television station for a year. I had stumbled into radio on bluff and bravado and gained a tremendous education. Spent 5 years in an award-winning ad agency, and now fate had rounded out my resume quite nicely. Fate had a few other surprises in store for me in my personal life as well. I went to a Unitarian cocktail party and saw the most handsome man I had ever seen across the room. Judging him to probably be equally egotistical and no longer trusting very handsome young men, I spent the night crossing the room in the opposite direction he went, determined not to run into him. I survived the party without encounter and joined a group for dinner, only to find myself seated right across from him. In the end, I took him home, and ultimately we married. We were deeply comfortable together, he and I. He was an intellectual with a great sense of honor, deeply wounded from his childhood, but who isn't? I didn't understand the drivers implanted from my childhood, and I had already fully embarked on my you need to be more giving, smarter, prettier, sexier, nicer, funnier, and more talented than anyone else around you to be equal and deserve life phase. That translates to a woman heading for being superwoman and a potential victim. I subbed for a late-night radio talk show host
on occasion as well during those days, and I remember an incident that foretold a lot, but which took another 20 years to finally make sense. The regular talk show host was a conservative, and needless to say, I considered myself a liberal. I received great joy in what I considered opening the minds of his listeners when I did his show. On one particular night, I chose to talk about a very controversial legal situation. It was a court case in a nearby state in which a black woman had been jailed as an accomplice to a burglary. Her boyfriend had stolen something while she was riding in her car. During the night, her white jailer entered her cell and raped her. During the rape, she managed to grab a knife from his belt, stab him, and run. He died, his semen splayed on the walls and his pants around his knees. She fled to another state, fearing Southern justice, and an extradition process was begun. She fled to another state, fearing Southern justice, and an extradition process was begun to bring her back to face murder charges. Feminists were appalled. Rednecks wanted blood. I merely brought the circumstances to the attention of my listeners that evening, representing both sides of the argument, though I admit my obvious bias towards what I consider to be an enlightened and compassionate point of view. I interviewed a local judge regarding the legal issues and also interviewed area feminists to get the argument on the woman's behalf. When the show was over, I switched the FM to automatic as I did every night, checked the logs, and closed down the station. I exited the side door, shutting the lights off behind me. I was alone in the station, as always at that hour. I walked out into the huge parking lot to find a row of cars down one side of the parking lot, another row of cars down the other side of the lot, and a row of police cars down the middle, holding them apart from one another. The cars on the right were there to hurt me, the cars on the left were there to defend me, and the police were there to keep order. I slunk to my car and drove home and sobbed all night. How could anyone have been angry at the truth? And how could they hate me so? I was only shedding light on the dark truth. Why didn't people want to know the whole story? It was a crisis point in my Southern life, a life where a woman is not supposed to offend or question. By dawn, I had come to the realization that essentially I had a power which I hadn't wanted and didn't know what to do with. People, I sadly realized, either really, really liked me or really, really disliked me. There was, for whatever reason, no middle ground. This incident pointed this out regarding my speaking voice. I was later to realize I had the same effect on people with my writing and even my sheer presence. That night and for many years to come, it brought me great pain to imagine having such a presence. I was frightened of power and wanted nothing to do with it. This book is so relatable. Okay. I much preferred to be loved by all, seeking only approval. It was years later and many more tearful nights before I came to respect and accept this particular power as something to own, something to use to make a difference. It would be decades before I realized that people who make a difference usually offend someone. People pleasers seldom trigger change. My husband's government career moved us to Washington, D.C., and I began a consulting business, incorporating everything I had learned in my years in advertising. Perhaps it was the sands in the biological hourglass and their ever-present descent from future into past. But my husband and I began to speak of children, and ultimately I had two exquisite daughters. But our life began to unravel with the intrusions into our private time. First, Jennifer developed allergic reactions to milk, soy, all protein, and all sugar. As I struggled with that diagnosis and some system of nutrition for her, Adrian began a series of ear infections that continued until she was about 12 years old. Nights became a blur of shuffling from one room to another, from rocking one while she screamed in pain, to cross the hallway to lift another crying infant into my arms. These were my superwoman days, as I lived on about 4 hours of sleep, broken by feedings and disruption, and then served my clients during the day. My office was in-home, and I had full-time help, which meant I could be with one daughter while the other help was with the other. That way I could be with the girls when I wasn't on a deadline and make sure no one hurt them. My oldest, Jennifer, literally cried most of the time due to the stomach discomfort she was in. And from 10 days of age, she never napped. She finally fell asleep crying at midnight. She woke crying at 2 a.m. and again at 4 a.m. and was up for good up at 6 a.m. every day. The youngest simply cried all the time when she had an ear infection. She had 12 in her second year. Oh, that's intense. Motherhood is very challenging as it is, but damn, that's a lot. That's a lot. When I visited my clients, I frequently took the girls and the sitter along, stopping along the way at a playground or a children's museum or a mall. That way they could play while I handled business meetings. We were living near Washington, D.C. at this point, and so it was only logical, as I was prone to stumbling through life now, that I fall into political consulting. I had a gift there too, it seems. I treated the politicians the same way I treated a shoe company. It was really quite simple. It is all just understanding what the client stands on and what his soul is made of and how to outpicture that in the marketplace. I find that really fascinating because I've actually met someone who has that same gift and used it in his career. I believe it was marketing and advertisement as well. And I just think that's really fascinating when you can look at someone. I guess in a way I kind of do that too with my one-on-one pole classes. Like I'm able to gauge the need, where they're at, how to best support them. But for someone to see what someone's soul is made out of and how, or someone's soul and how to transfer that into something physical that you can like visually see or hear, that's fascinating. I think so. Okay. I think I'm gonna do a couple more minutes and call it a night. It was during the management of a particular campaign that I became painfully aware of the encroaching power of the right-wing evangelical agenda. The ominous and obvious portents terrified me. My crystal ball foretold a future ahead with chiseled constitutional rights. I foresaw a horrible future world dominated by the kind of consciousness I grew up around, narrow and bigoted and ignorant. I saw censorship ahead and loss of freedoms, all in the name of God and righteousness, mind you. I felt totally helpless in the face of this writer, as I felt in my life in general. I was astride the back of a horse, nothing like the horse of my childhood. Where this one was headed, I didn't want to go, but I was in observation mode. My action button hadn't yet been engaged. Okay, okay. The more my daughters demanded, the more my husband withdrew. He left for work at about 6 a.m. and returned around 5 p.m. to take a long hot bath, something I greatly envied. Then he either disappeared into the office, at home, or into the television. He emerged from 1 or 3 hours later. I could probably count the number of times he put the girls to bed on my fingers and toes. Emotionally, he became colder and colder until one day I realized it had been 3 years since he had touched me, and I wasn't allowed to make overtures. My attempts at dialoguing about it were fruitless. My demands for counseling birthed only one worthless marriage counselor, who could have created divorce between the world's greatest lovers. Damn, I cried myself to sleep most nights, and he never noticed. One day I recall standing by the foot of the bed. "Why don't you ever touch me any more?" I asked, biting my lip, steadying myself for his answer. "I don't find you attractive any more." That was all he had to say. He went back to reading then, and I went back to keeping the girls from bothering him, which is how I spent my evenings. He didn't like to hear them cry. However, my business life was starkly successful, and we lived in the right town, and we drove the right car, and I had Oriental rugs and antiques again, and the girls were in the very best nursery school and had been tested for gifted programs, which was very good in Northern Virginia, if you were anybody who dreamed of having successful toddlers. Then the visitations began. I was asleep in my own bed one night, and I felt a finger prodding my arm. I turned over and opened my eyes, expecting to see Jennifer standing there, wanting my attention. Instead, I was shocked to see no one was standing there. But when I looked at my arm, my skin was indenting in cadence to the feeling of someone poking me in the arm. I looked around the room, and there at the foot of the bed was a large, luminous shape, rather like the shape of a human body, but with no body, only a glowing, pulsing presence. It extended a fiery finger and whispered to me, "Come and write." And I got up and went into my office and began a series of poems I later called the Phantom Series. These poems desperately hungered to know what this presence was. Sorry. It was definitely male presence, a highly sexual feeling presence. I yearned to know who had entered my life this way, reminding me what passion was missing from my own existence. I have chased you across the paths of time, through birth and death and birth and death. You ignite me, and I burn, I wrote to him. My childhood experience with the three lights visiting me in my room one night had left me with a great interest in the paranormal. I'd read a book on Edgar Cayce when I was quite young and fully accepted the understanding of reincarnation and karma. It just felt right, and my soul knew the truth of it, for me anyway. But it had been a while since anything had come to call, especially anything that had changed me so. After these visitations, which continued nightly for 9 months, I began to write a newspaper column, and I moved back more deeply into alternative spirituality with a growing ferocity and commitment. My previous interest had been in the paranormal, but now I began to contemplate God, and I knew that it was I. My husband thought I was crazy, but the visitations continued for 9 months, long enough to birth a newspaper column, which I wrote for the next 4 years for the local paper. One of my first columns was about the first day Jennifer went to kindergarten. It waxed quite poetic about a mother's hope for her child, intending to speak about the hope we have for all children, only using my own experience as a metaphor. I remember one line read, "May your toe shoes never hurt." It only appeared to be about Jennifer going to kindergarten, but was much more about childhood and life and loss, all couched in a melange of beautiful language. It spoke to all our hopes and dreams for all our children, and for whatever reason, people hated me for writing it. The editor was a friend, and he understood the power of columnists. He was delighted with the controversy I had created, and featured the hate mail boldly in print. They're totally capitalizing. Oh my god. Hold up. I just want to reread this again. May your toe shoes never hurt. I mean, how could they hate me for writing a sweet column about my daughter going to kindergarten and all my hopes and dreams for her? I have read and reread that column, and to this day I can only see it provoking tears, not hatred. But instead, I opened the paper the week after it appeared, and there were two facing pages of hate letters about my writing. I cried all week. Next week, the paper came out, and there were letters praising my writing. I was up against my old issue of pleasing people. Why couldn't they all love me? One day I signed a check at the grocery store, and the checkout clerk recognized my name and commented on my column, which led the woman to say how which led the woman behind to say how much she hated me, which led the woman behind her to say how much she loved me. I slunk out of the store and went home and cried again. Ah, that's intense, and I feel like most of us, whether you're male or female, alpha or beta, whatever you, however you identify yourself as, struggle with people pleasing. Because it's like ingrained in us, like it's socially acceptable to cater to other people's emotions. Usually our parents, whether they're right or wrong. So it's like I feel like that's something that we all struggle with, is people pleasing. Even to this day, like I see it come up in little ways here and there, which is like, oh, didn't know that was still there, but that's fun. Otis. I told myself that if my 5-year-old could grow up and go to school, I could grow up too. Growing up, to me in this instance, referred to getting over my fears of not being wanted and not being approved of. It was the same old abandonment. Why doesn't anyone love me stuff? And you know what? It was holding me back from being all I could be. I knew that as long as I cared what people thought, I wouldn't be all I could be. I was using all my energy trying to write pleasing things, please my husband, please my children, please my clients. I had no energy left for me. My life is a series of stumbles and cracks. I stumble into something and then I crack and get out. I guess I should have known that a fissure was opening a hole in my marriage large enough for me to fall through. We were traveling different roads and only meeting occasionally when we came upon a crossroads. But I don't give up easily, and I kept trying to make things work or pretend that it didn't matter that I wasn't happy. One night we went to dinner with a friend who was in town on business. He always took us out to dinner during his visits. And on this occasion, we were in Georgetown at a French restaurant where the waiters wore roller skates and jumped on stage and did little musical numbers in between courses. I'd had a drink, which was very unusual for me. It only takes one drink to make me very happy and very tipsy. Emotionally, I melted, remembering the man I had fallen in love with and married, the man I'd felt strongly enough about to have children with, and so I leaned over and ran my fingers along his neck, imagining deeply luscious thoughts of sensuality. He never looked around, but he must have mistaken my fingers caressing his neck for an insect, because he slapped his hand around behind his neck, like he would swipe at a fly to shoo it away. That was probably intentional. That's cold. That's so ugly. It felt like someone had slapped me in my heart. It was for whatever reason the last straw, the last intimacy rejection of the hundreds I had suffered with him. I snapped. I stood up, slipped the keys toward him so he would have the car. God knows I didn't deserve the car myself, and walked out the door. I had 25 cents in my purse when I hailed a taxi and asked him to take me to a bank machine so I could pay the cab fare the 30 miles out of Reston to where we lived. The cab driver was an Iraqi student working on his PhD. We stopped, and I picked up a girlfriend along the way. She had a trumpet, and I stopped at the house and picked up my clarinet, and we sat together in the main plaza in town, and we played music. She on the trumpet and me on the clarinet. Cab driver was on tabla and vocals. That's awesome. We played and sang the blues on Lake Ann Plaza until sunrise. I sang about lost love. She sang about lost youth. He sang about the horrors of war. Why no one complained, I don't know. I intended to leave that night, but he talked me into staying for a few weeks, saying a mother with 2 small children shouldn't have to go out in the cold. He said if I could just give him a few weeks, he'd find a place. But he never left. I found out later that his father had advised him not to leave, fearing I might say he deserted and claimed the house. He obviously didn't know me. I walk away from houses and antiques. Oh, so much to be said about like the dissolution of marriage. Like, I get it. His father was just trying to protect his son and what he sees as his son's assets. But clearly, his wife is a working woman, a fucking full-time working woman, just like him, while holding down the house and the kids and everything else. So, but I also understand her mindset because I'm twice divorced and both times I walked away and I didn't ask for nothing. I didn't give a fuck. I didn't give a fuck. I didn't know where I was gonna sleep. Leaving the first divorce or marriage separation. Leaving the first marriage, I didn't know where I was gonna sleep. I didn't care. I was done. I had a car. That was enough for me. And then the second time, when I walked away from the second marriage, thankfully, it worked out so perfectly, the synchronicity of everything. But thankfully, I did have an apartment, and he was actually supportive of me moving out and getting space and healing. But it was only because he kept thinking that if he was kind to me, he would get me back. So it was like self-serving for him, you know what I mean? It wasn't genuine. It was just him basically trying to manipulate me into getting back with him. But same deal, like I was a stay-at-home mom for several years, and I had reached my breaking point and had said enough was enough. Like, I can't do it anymore. I can't live in this lie. Didn't have a job. Didn't care. I was done. Oh, I knew I was gonna be alright, and I was. Okay, then I'm gonna stop there. Damn, I read a lot. Oof, but we're just getting started. Okay, yeah, it's my little pickle eraser for my bookmark. But yeah, oh, that book is good. Very triggering though. So yeah, until next time, guys. Thanks for supporting. Let me see if I can figure out how to leave. Kiss me, we're on fire.